academia has had its Me Too moment. It happened in India, it happened in the global south. The global north was just not listening.
Hello, and thank you for listening to the Global Health Uprooted podcast. I'm Eliza, and in this episode, I had the privilege of speaking with Dr. Adrija Dey. Dr. Dey is a senior researcher at the University of Westminster and the Director of International Knowledge Exchange at the 1752 Group. Her research examines gender-based violence on university campuses with a specific focus on Indian universities. Her work has examined the intersectionalities of sexual and gender-based violence in higher education and the role of institutional structures. Dr. Dey's PhD work looked at the role of feminist digital activism from an interdisciplinary approach. A new project that she recently launched is entitled FemIDEAS and aims to decolonize research and activism around sexual and gender-based violence in higher education. You can find the links to these projects and other resources that we have discussed in the podcast description. This podcast does discuss sensitive topics related to sexual and gender-based violence. However, there are no explicit mentions of incidences of violence. If you or someone you know has experienced sexual or gender-based violence, you can call 112 for support, or at Karolinska Institutet specifically, you can reach out to your study counselor or ombudsperson. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy listening to this insightful conversation. Hi, Dr. Dey. Thank you so much for joining us here today. If you could just start by giving a brief introduction to yourself and how your work specifically relating to gender-based violence and maybe the intersection with colonialism.
I'm Adrija, and I'm a senior research fellow at the University of Westminster. And I'm also the director of International Knowledge Exchange at the 1752 Group, which is a policy and campaigning group looking specifically at sexual and gender-based violence in higher education in the UK. So my past work, my PhD has been on digital feminist activism, and specifically looking at how women and queer folks have been using digital technologies in India for gender-related activism. But one of the interesting things happened when I was doing my fieldwork and I was interviewing activists, and I was asking them, what were the reasons for their involvement in feminist organizing and activism. Majority of them spoke about witnessing, dealing, or facing sexual and gender-based violence within higher education. And that was kind of the point at which they decided to go into feminist activism, which I found very interesting, but also gave me a lot to think about and reflect and introspect about my university life, my activism, my involvement within groups. And that's why my postdoc work, I specifically started focusing and narrowing down on higher education. And in my postdoc, I looked at sexual and gender-based violence in higher education in India through an intersectional lens, so looking at power relations specifically within education, and trying to see how that manifests through an intersectional lens of class, caste, gender, sexuality, nationality, etc. My current project right now is kind of expanding the work that I'm doing around sexual violence in higher education to now I'm looking at South Africa, Nigeria, Chile, Brazil, and indigenous communities of New Zealand. And the idea behind the project, which is called Decolonizing Sexual and Gender-Based Violence in Higher Education, and the project is called FemIDEAS. So it's feminist, intersectionality, decolonization, equality, abolition, and survivor-centered. So these are the guiding principles of this project. We are very much focusing on the Global South, what is happening in the Global South in terms of theory, policies, and practices, including feminist movements and activisms. What can the Global North learn from that? So shifting a little bit these imperial geographies of knowledge production and, whose voices are heard, whose voices are not heard. And I'm doing the entire project, trying to do the entire project, keeping survivor voices and being guided by survivor narratives.
Yeah, those both sound like really great and really interesting projects. And I like the way you kind of, the shift is because you saw it as like an issue in the interviews you were doing and really saw it kind of firsthand. Both of these really discuss a lot of intersectionalities, and that's really important to a lot of the work you're doing. And our organization is focused on decolonizing of global health, and that's kind of where this podcast is focused. Colonialism and other power dynamics can also be at play in a lot to responses to or causes of gender-based violence. And in some of your previous work for both your PhD with the digital activism as part of like India's Me Too movement, and also now with this higher education, a lot of the Me Too movement generally has been dominated by white, Western, middle class, heterosexual women. But how do you feel like this movement formulated into like the space you saw in India with Indian activism, or some of the space you're starting to see now in different global South spaces? And how can the future movement center more on these diverse voices rather than on just like heterosexual white middle class women?
There are quite a few different layers to your questions, and it's very interesting. So like whenever I say I think and like work around the Me Too movement, it's very much like my Me Too movement is Tarana Burke's Me Too movement, which started much, much before Alicia Milano's Me Too movement, which was about creating spaces for women of color who were survivors of sexual and gender-based violence to show them that they are not alone, and they have a community of people who can support them, and support them to get justice and to heal. But you're right, so there are two different layers to the work that I do, right? So firstly, there's been a lot of talk, especially in the UK in the last few years, there's been a couple of cases, like big high profile cases in universities, which was followed by the Degrees of Abuse podcast done by Al Jazeera. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. It kind of calls out by name very powerful perpetrators in UK higher education. And following that, a lot of people kind of started saying, oh, when will academia have its Me Too moment, right? While it was also like, it was good to see so much conversation happening around sexual violence in academia, I was also of the opinion that, academia has had its Me Too moment. It happened in India, it happened in the global South. The global North was just not listening. So these kind of knowledge exchange and exchange of information is very much still not happening in the work that we are doing. And this is not only in academia, it is also within activism and policy work. And a big part of my project is to kind of fill in that gap. But also, so this is the larger imperial construct of, which voices are heard and which voices are not, like I was saying. But also within India, there's been a critique of the same critique, but based on things like caste, right? The voices, upper caste, upper class, heterosexual cis women are heard, or or they feel empowered to speak out, but Dalit women, or women coming from the lower classes, women coming from tribal families, queer women, trans people, they don't feel empowered to speak out. And to understand their experiences, we have to understand these different power dynamics and intersectionalities. And I think any future work, if it does not take into consideration these intersecting patterns of oppression, I believe, honestly, is great, because you can never understand sexual violence or gender-based violence and sexual harassment without understanding it through the lens of intersectionality.
I definitely agree that there's the intersectionality piece is very important, and it's impossible to understand the experience and even how to solve or address some of these issues without understanding that, because otherwise you're not looking at the full picture of what's happening. I was also really curious, in the first part of your answer, you mentioned that how there has been the Me Too movement was earlier, and it happened in academia in a lot of places in the global South, but had not reached, a lot of the academic institutions in the global North. And that's a lot of what your project is currently working on, gathering some of that knowledge to share more widely. I know it's a new project and it's just getting started, but I was just curious if there's any example or types of information that you think would be interesting for our listeners to kind of get an idea of what some of this knowledge is that could be useful for creating change?
Okay, thank you. And I actually think that I'm going to give you an example from my previous research, which I think can be quite interesting. So one of the things that, was very common was when I went to India to do this research, a lot of people would be like, oh my God, you're so lucky that you're from UK and you don't have to face this kind of problem. And when I would come to UK and talk about this in conferences, and this is from even very progressive circles, a lot of people would come up to me and say that, oh my God, this is such a global South problem, like such a brown people problem, which I found to be, I wasn't surprised at this reaction. To a certain extent, like it made me really think about how still, ideas of imperialism and colonialism is so deeply ingrained in our thought process, and it manifests even in just very small everyday experiences, right? But what is interesting is that, like, sexual and gender-based violence in higher education is a universal global problem. It manifests maybe in some culturally different ways, but I am surprised always to see the similarities of experiences narrated by survivors in campuses across the world, because higher education is shaped, the power dynamics, the hierarchy is structured in very similarly across the world, right? And a lot of them are colonial imports. For example, in India, the structure of higher education is exactly the same as the structure of higher education in the UK. But if you look at how sexual and gender-based violence is dealt with, in India, these conversations around sexual violence and harassment in the workspace started in 1997 with a big case of the gang rape of a Dalit woman called Adrija Dey, and leading to the Vishakha guidelines, which mandated that every workspace should have a sexual harassment committee called the Internal Complaints Committee, the role of which would be to take complaints, investigate complaints, and provide recommendations to support survivors and to also raise awareness. Following that, this was kind of adopted within the higher education, and some universities, like the Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi, formed an absolutely exemplary committee called GS-CASH, or the Gender Sensitization Committee for Sexual Harassment. They have a website, and they have a lot of information on the website if you want to check it out. And in 2013, these guidelines were converted into the sexual harassment in the workspace law. And while many of the more radical measures suggested by the guidelines were left out when in the legal measures, there is still a universal legal mechanism there in India to guide all institutions. And these guidelines and mechanisms are not there because the government felt kind towards survivors of sexual violence, or because the kindness of the state or of the status quo. They are there because feminist, activists, queer and trans students, political activists, survivors, lawyers vigorously pushed for it for years and years to implement it. And I'm not romanticizing it by saying that, everything is fine and everything is okay and we are great. We are not. I'm also not saying that we have to, the legal route is the route to change, because I absolutely don't believe that as a feminist abolitionist. But if we have to compare what is happening in India and what is happening in say, for example, the UK, India is actually way, way, way ahead in this conversation than in the UK. In the UK, we are literally just starting off the conversation that we need a universal guideline across institution to deal with sexual harassment, right? That is not even, it's like basically just literally at the starting phase of that conversation. And much of the mechanisms that have been implemented, they've been implemented as a result of marketization, because students have said, we are paying customers and we don't have the services that we deserve. And hence many of these are like tick box mechanisms rather than thought out, feminist, survivor-centered pathways for change, healing, and justice. But the interesting thing is in the UK, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. We don't need to think about new ways, because what works in India can work word by word in the University of London. Because of these similar structures due to colonization. But what we see is always, even now, the flow of knowledge is expected to be from the global north to the global south, what the global south can learn from the global north. But what I'm trying to push for is to kind of to really decolonize doesn't mean to read, a handful of Black and brown authors and say that we have decolonized. Decolonization truly means centering the voices and actively learning from mechanisms and mostly movements of the global south and implementing them to change.
Yeah, that was, I think, a really great example and a really concrete way that through some of these guidelines or kind of boards that you can create, I think that would definitely how these different ideas can be applied in different contexts and what will work and what maybe wouldn't. And I also just wanted to mostly to understand that for the commonalities also, I'm currently based in Sweden, right? And so in a recent study in Sweden, among 38 top universities, 4% of the staff and students reported undesired sexual attention in the last 12 months. And over a longer period of time, about 38% of people reported unwanted advances. And I think people do tend to forget that these, or not forget, I guess it's brushed under the rug that these things are happening all over the world, as you said. So I mean, one of the questions I'd had was, what are the commonalities that you see in this situation between the UK or maybe Sweden and India? I mean, you discussed it a little bit, but do you have any additions to this? Like what things you think are some of the issues that might be the same or some of the potential solutions that might be the same?
I think, to answer this question, and that is why I think, these conversations that we are having, the fact that we are connected is so important, is to kind of develop these commonalities. And I think it is a process. Like within the UK, with UK and India, I've already talked about these commonalities. But I also think that, again, the structures of higher education, the power dynamics within higher education, the power dynamics between lecturers and students, it's such a global phenomenon that the experiences of violence, harassment, within exploitation within these structures are also very similar. So it's very, very important for people across the world to have these exchanges and conversations for us to find these commonalities. Also, one of the things that I wanted to say was that the importance of data, because largely still concrete nationwide data or cross-country data on the experiences of sexual harassment within higher education is largely missing. This is something that I'm trying to do with my project, but to do some surveys to get results which are comparable as well. But again, data which focuses not only numbers but also experiences are very, very important. And the third thing what I wanted to say was there is a project that I started in 2020 which is called North-South Feminist Dialogues, and we've done 2 sessions of that. The first one was specifically on what the UK and India can learn through an exchange from each other around this, and it was a 3-day workshop during the pandemic. And the next one was last year, which was on online sexual harassment in higher education. And it was a 1-day workshop. And we have produced 2 reports, which are on the 1752 group resources section. You'll find both these reports. And there's some quite useful information on what we have found in terms of common ground and knowledge exchange.
Great. That's great to hear that there has been some of this inner dialogue happening, because I do agree that that's really important. And I did look a little bit at those resources, and it definitely does seem very interesting. And you've gotten at least a good start to some of this. And then in terms of this, there's also the importance of making sure we have shared definitions and understanding in order to create these dialogues. And so I was actually in one of your 2020 papers, you discussed 2 concepts of sensitization and activism. Can you maybe describe your definition of these 2 terms and maybe what your distinction is between them within this field?
So I'll start with sensitization, because that's the most interesting term, because I quite didn't realize when I came to the UK that this wasn't a global term. So sensitization basically means consciousness raising, right? Or spreading the word, raising consciousness, raising awareness. But in India, we use the term sensitization for that. And whenever I would speak about sensitization, people in the global north would not have any idea. But I also think that it's a much nicer term. It has some kind of like sensitivity and care embedded in it. It just feels. And so in my work, I just choose, and it's a term used by my friends, activists, comrades in the global south. So in my work, I kind of choose to use that term because I also think it's important to foreground language, which is used in the global south in the process of decolonization. The term activism for me just encompasses collective action, formation of collective identity resulting in collective action to push for structural changes, but at the same time also building a community of love, care, who can be there for each other, who can care for each other, and create imaginations of a new future.
Yeah, I think that's a great definition. I really like the idea that it's using your imagination to create this new future. I mean, and kind of going off of that, there is within, I guess, both sensitization, so raising this awareness, and activism, like communal action towards structural change or pushing for structural change. There's, in both cases, I think there's a need to address long-term cultural change. As we talked about, some of this goes far beyond just the legal system. Like even if you have legal structures there, that's unfortunately not always, or quite often not sufficient. And often this has to be done through working within existing structures, and there's a need for more of this radical rejection of these power structures that currently exist. So how do you think we can work to address the need for these cultural changes that need to happen in regards to gender-based violence?
It's a very important question. We can only start thinking about change when we are thinking about changing of culture, but also changing of the structure, right? Because it is the structure which enables the culture. So in a way, higher education, the power dynamics, the hierarchy, the neoliberalization, those are the structures which enable a culture of racism, sexism, patriarchy, casteism to thrive. And those two are related. So while often we kind of look at the cultures of higher education, we forget to look at the structures of it. And I think it's important to look at both. So for example, like, we are on strike right now. And a lot of people have asked me, what does strike have to do with the work that I do? And my responses have always been to that is, we are striking for casualization, pay, gender pay gap, precarity, pensions. And we have seen that all of that is intrinsically related to sexual and gender-based violence, because people who are in the most precarious contracts are the people who are most commonly targeted by powerful perpetrators, knowing that they're probably the most powerless within the hierarchies of academia. A lot of them are PhD students or research associates who directly work under a powerful perpetrator. For many of them, their harassment is tied to their livelihood. And we are living in a cost of, we are in a cost of living crises. So a lot of people filing cases of complaint might mean losing their job, might mean not having shelter, food, security, right? So we cannot talk about sexual violence if we don't talk about all of this, right? We also have to talk about the ridiculous amount that students need to pay to even access higher education, which means who can access higher education. But for me, it's both of these things are intrinsically related, and we cannot change one without changing the other. So while we, on one hand, have to talk about everyday violence as a spectrum, starting from everyday invisibilized sexism, banter, to sexual violence and rape on the other hand, we also have to at the same time talk about the oppression of capitalism, the oppression of neoliberalism, the oppression of patriarchy that shape these cultures.
A couple of the people that I've read, there's a lot of this of the twisting twins, and often that's talked about as the issues of capitalism and racial issues. But I also think if you add the patriarchy, and you kind of get a twisting vines, I guess.
Yeah.
Rather than just the twisting twins or like the evil twins. And I definitely think that that's really important to understand how these things, nothing exists in isolation. And all of these kind of structures of university, legal systems, funding, capitalism, job support, welfare systems, they all like really link together. And I think that is also really important to also think about how would you fit this all in with some of these decolonizing efforts. I personally believe that a lot of this requires thinking from a more decolonial mindset, kind of no matter where you're located, but just in terms of these academic structures, how do you think what are some of the efforts you think need to be done to begin this decolonization? Some of it's begun, but mostly just through discourse at this point, I think. And it hasn't moved much beyond that, at least in the context I've been in. So how do you maybe see that beginning or taking shape?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I've been doing a lot of thinking about it, myself, because where do we even begin? But a couple of things to think about again, like I said, that very often we think of decolonization as reading two authors of color and be done with it, right? And in many cases, because decolonization has become such a buzzword in academia, it's almost become a tick box exercise to say that, well, done, we have, our decolonization is done. But it requires a lot more reflection, a lot more introspection, a lot more funding, a lot more resources, a lot more will from people, a lot more listening. And it is a process of continuous learning and relearning. So decolonization for me very much is also, we don't have to pay for our education. Like everybody has equal right to education. So we don't have to pay to be in the university. And as soon as you say that you have to pay for education, these becomes elite spaces, and who can access it and who can't. And the people who are left out, and the voices that are left out, are people from the most marginalized communities, are people of color, are people are queer and trans folk, and their voices become invisibilized. So a process of decolonization is also providing access for students like this. And I don't mean that in the narrow focus of identity politics. I mean as a structural change, right? If we are, of course, our curriculum needs to encompass authors from the global south, but it doesn't mean that if you're reading people from the global south, you only read the upper caste, upper class voices. Decolonization means supporting people from Palestine and Kashmir and indigenous communities across the world. It is reading their stories and centering their stories. It is pushing back against not only colonization, but neocolonization, and understanding how capital actually benefits from the legacies of imperialism and colonization, and calling that out within higher education. It means developing and pushing for a critical higher education that allows us to think freely. It allows for reflection and critical engagement, and not towards just producing workers for the transnational workforce. It also means centering voices and needs of survivors. It means creating spaces of care where people can come and heal. So it's so much more than the narrow focus it's used usually in higher education, almost like decolonization has become a marketing stunt.
Yeah, I definitely think that's a really good point, that it's almost become a buzzword now, saying decolonization, and not actually thinking about what it really means or how you address or tackle it. And I think we've all faced that a little bit as students, who do notice that some people will just either shy away from the term, that it's really scary, or it becomes just like a checkbox that they fill instead of actually trying to make change or shift who's running a research project or these kind of things. For students in general, are there things that maybe as an individual or as a small organization that you think we can start doing to support this process of decolonization and with gender-based violence?
Again, I think there is so much to do, but little things that we could do. Again, reaching out and reading what people are saying from the global south, but really reading indigenous scholars, women of color, writing by queer and trans people, and actually really thinking about us within higher education, how that influences what we research, how we research, and who we research is so important. There is a lot of writing by indigenous scholars on power dynamics of research, on feminist decolonial research. And I really, really encourage everyone to engage with it because there's so much to learn on and challenge the colonial practices within research and higher education. Secondly, also to kind of use the resources that we have to redistribute some of that is like, a lot of people in the global south don't have access to elite journals that we have. So, even to like download journal articles and, provide access, provide small groups, which which campaigns for more scholarships for international students, pushing your university to increase scholarships for international students, reading SOPs, reading resumes, reading PhD proposals, and giving feedback. So as a part of my project, I think we're going to bring together a group of people who are going to, in the global north, who have the privilege and who are willing to do this free labor for people who in the global south who don't have this kind of access. But it's also really good practice to kind of like, use our position to kind of redistribute some of this. But also, I think a very important part of this conversation is to create conversations of like, disruptions, but also of care around decolonization, where people can learn through conversations, but also to create the knowledge that decolonization also means giving up of power and privilege, right? Is to be mindful of power and privilege, and is to kind of deeply think about how that, how this power kind of privileges us and how we can redistribute some of that.
All really great information for us to take away. Thank you so much. Is there anything else that you wanted to mention today that we haven't talked about before we close up?
Just that, just follow the project for news and updates. We have some really exciting things coming up, including film screenings, and you can follow us on Twitter on FemIDEAS, or if you want to join our mailing list, very soon we're going to have our website where you can like subscribe for updates and our newsletters. So just follow the project.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I really, really appreciate you coming on today.